Yes, well, let me respond first to I think, a misconception to Professor Blecker, I think, promoted a moment ago about productivity growth. The United States has had productivity growth for generations. That's not the cause of job loss. For example, during President Clinton's term, we had created 23 million jobs. We had stable manufacturing employment. The problem really started in 2000. Since then, we've lost 6 million manufacturing jobs. We had essentially the same rates of productivity growth in the 90s we did in the last decade. And yet in the last decade, we lost 6 million manufacturing jobs. And that is the entire reason for that is largely due to the growth of imports. And China is the largest source of the growth in those imports. Now, in terms of these deals that were cut and announced yesterday, they were actually cut a year or two ago. These deals have been announced several years ago. This is just the formal government approval of the sale of these 200 jets by Boeing to the Chinese airlines. And these sales are going to be accumulated over the next decade or so. They're going to be a drop in the bucket compared to the growth in imports from China, which have surged enormously just in the past year, as I mentioned earlier. I'm also very concerned about the GE deal. GE is essentially giving away its technological keys to the kingdom in exchange for a few short-term sales. They've set up a joint venture with a Chinese company. They throw in $200 million, and their most advanced avionics technology to their Chinese partner, who pays them handsomely for it, who puts in $700 billion. In return, they're going to get some sales to Chinese aircraft manufacturers, which many other companies have been competing for. But there's a pattern here. What happens is that the Chinese joint venture partners tend to suck the technology out of their foreign partners, and then they kick them aside in a few years. So GE says this deal is good for 50 years. I can almost guarantee you that the deal will end in just a few years. And as a result, GE will find that it's no longer in the business of making avionics equipment. That business will have shifted to this Chinese company.
And Robert Scott, the story of Evergreen Solar, an amazing story of a U.S. company that received $43 million in state subsidies from Massachusetts for its solar panel factory in 2008, now announced it's shutting the factory and moving to China.
That's right. And the reason for that is because China has offered huge subsidies to Evergreen and other solar manufacturers to build their plants in China. And that's not about cheap labor. Cheap labor has nothing to do with it. The biggest cost of building a solar plant is the cost of the plant itself, the capital invested, which is rising exponentially. China offered this company interest rates of 4.8%. And they financed 60% of the new plant in China, and they don't. Evergreen doesn't even have to make a payment of interest or principal on those loans until 2015. So this is a tremendous subsidy to Evergreen, and is really symptomatic of the much bigger problem of subsidies and currency manipulation in particular, which makes it almost impossible for U.S. firms to compete with China on a level playing field.
But can you blame China for wanting to continue to develop its own national economy, given the fact that it is the largest country in the world and its people have been in poverty for so long that even in terms of the issue of developing of bullet trains, of green technology, of infrastructure development, China is forging ahead to try to build a more prosperous society. So you can't really blame them. The question is, what is the United States doing in terms of assuring the future of its own economic development?
Well, I certainly encourage China to maximize its own development, encourage them to develop their own green technology. The problem is that they are violating many standards of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, that they agreed to when they joined the WTO in 2001. For example, currency manipulation. China spent almost $800 billion in the last year alone manipulating its currency. That makes its products about 40% cheaper than they would be on the open market, and acts like a tax on U.S. exports to China and everywhere else in the world. So China is competing unfairly. If China wants to play the game like everybody else, I welcome that competition. But I think China's problem is they focus too much on exports and not enough on developing their domestic economy, where they have tremendous potential for growth.
Mark Blecker, we just have 30 seconds. Your final response.
The issue of protectionism is a bit of a red herring, or a bit hypocritical for us. All the major Western capitalist economies in their formative periods protected their economies. China is expected to develop its economy at a time of WTO and free trade. They are not going to be able to do that and support a population that they need to. So I think we need to understand their need to protect things, and I would like to see us have an active industrial policy like China does, so that we would be developing high-speed rail at the pace that they are and getting out of our airplanes and out of our cars and into high-speed rail. China is a model for this, and the U.S. state should follow them.
Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us. Mark Blecker, professor at Oberlin College, for making your way into Cleveland, and Robert Scott, senior international economist at the Economic Policy Institute, author of Counting the Jobs Lost to China. Thanks so much for being there in Washington, D.C. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report. We'll be back in a minute.